relationship between South Africa and the United States has been quite turbulent. Now, Donald Trump and social media posts at the weekend threatening to skip the G20 Summit in South Africa, again citing concerns, baseless concerns, over land confiscation and genocide. He made these statements on his Truth Social platform. Now, of course, it's well documented, well spoken about over the last few weeks, from the recall of the South African ambassador to the withdrawal of PEPFAR funding for South Africa's HIV/AIDS program. The relationship between the United States and South Africa, the worst it's ever been. But what do both countries want? What is it that these countries want? I speak now to Michael Walsh, who's a non-resident senior fellow in the Africa program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Michael, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's quite late where you are at the moment, but if we were to put two people at a table, Cyril Ramaphosa and Donald Trump, in a bilateral, and we write, this is what we want from each other, this is what we don't want from each other. From the United States point of view, what does Donald Trump want from South Africa?
Well, so Trump himself has a number of criticisms about the relationship right now. The one that's being emphasized in the social media post that you're talking about is really state-sanctioned racism and the white genocide argument that he's made, the land expropriation argument that he's made. That's really the emphasis that you see in that social media post. But there's other concerns, and these concerns are more bilateral or bipartisan concerns in the United States. It's the concern about undermining the national security interests and foreign policy interests of the United States. And we've heard that time and again. If we go back to the Lady R incident, we go back to the Hamas call. This is the sort of issue that really gravitates across the aisle. And you have both people on the Democratic side and the Republican side who have raised concerns about the government of South Africa undermining U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. So these are two separate issues. And in that social media post, he's really emphasizing the first issue, which is really a partisan issue in the United States. Not everyone is, even in the Republican Party, agrees with that as being the main issue between South Africa and the United States right now. But that's the one he's emphasizing in that social media post.
Let's deal with that first issue first. Are there people around Donald Trump that's saying, well, it's not the case? And I'll bring up a statistic for you. In the fourth quarter of 2024, there were 6,953 reported murders in South Africa. That is high. We have a violence problem in South Africa. But only 12 of them were farm murders, and only one of those 6,953 was in fact a farmer. Is there anyone around Donald Trump saying, sir, you may be having some of these statistics wrong?
So I don't know if directly around Donald Trump. He's surrounded by people on a daily basis, whether it's at the club in Florida or whether it's at the White House, where he's having these conversations and he's getting alternative facts presented to him that counter the arguments that he's made. But I do know that in Washington as a whole, in the think tank community, even in Congress, you have people in the Republican Party who have been voicing concern that that this narrative is running off course. Some people voice a concern that the narrative isn't a priority or isn't the priority, but other people actually challenge it on the grounds of the facts. And so I do think there's people on the Republican Party side who have thought that it's a mistake to focus on the white genocide specifically. I do think there's a lot of people on the Republican side who do believe in the state-sanctioned racism argument, but they wouldn't go as far as the white genocide arguments that have been voiced by the administration and by Trump himself in the past.
Let's talk about the second issue, about the bipartisan concern about America's interest. And this is, of course, South Africa's relationship with countries like Russia, China, our largest trading partner, with Iran. What does that say about the United States and its influence on how sovereign countries decide on who, in fact, are their partners. South Africa, and I'll bring in the history of Nelson Mandela, chastising the West to say, you don't tell us who our friends should be, Michael.
So it's a really complicated history between the U.S. and South Africa going back to the Reagan administration and the histories and the way it's framed. We had a webinar on Friday where we had Joel Polak, who is a Breitbart news editor. He's also a counsel there. He was one of the people floated to be the next U.S. ambassador to South Africa. And we had a conversation with him on Friday to discuss these issues. And we talked about history and we talked about the Reagan administration. And in the United States, the Reagan administration, a lot of what's remembered, obviously, is the end of the Reagan administration, where Nelson Mandela was, lifted up as a hero. But they forget about the conciliatory approach at the beginning of the administration with the apartheid regime and everything else that happened at the very beginning. And so it's complicated. It's selective. It's revisionist. It's how you remember history, and people have different framings and different revisionist versions of history. But I think one thing I raised in the webinar, which I thought was important, and I think this kind of gets to the heart of America's relationship with South Africa. At the same time as Nelson Mandela was being raised by the majority of Americans as a hero, he was still listed as a terrorist in the United States. And that's a very complicated history to unwind. And now we roll forward to where we are today. And I think on the South African side, it's also super complicated because you think about the amount of money that the U.S. has given to South Africa and how dependent South Africa became on aid. And the argument that the Trump administration would make is it's a sovereignty issue for the United States as well. The U.S. doesn't have to give aid. The U.S. doesn't have to give assistance to countries that undermine U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. And so I think you have both of these sides,
Yeah.
and they're coming to a head because there's just a fundamental difference in the framing of the relationship between, especially the ANC and the EFF and the Trump administration.
Is it not a conflation between the ANC as political party and the South African government? The spokesperson for the Department of International Relations says that Donald Trump, and including the Hudson Institute that you have written for, continues to conflate the ANC as a party, as a political party, and the government of which the ANC currently is the dominant member in a broad coalition.
Yeah, so if you look at the bill that was just introduced in the United States Congress, which is calling for the President of the United States and the U.S. government to provide information on whether or not, and it was South African government officials and ANC leaders. So they split it into two things. They didn't conflate it, but they're targeting both, right? And they're looking for who they can sanction. They're looking for who qualifies to be sanctioned under the U.S. sanctions regimes. And so I do think in the United States in general, because it's been it was a single party democracy for so long, and the ANC was in control of the government, and the ANC is in control of the defense portfolio and the foreign policy portfolio of South Africa, which is what the U.S. is really deeply concerned about right now. So I think that there is a conflation at times between the South African government and the ANC. And I think that, the Trump administration itself would argue that, the way to solve that would be to give somebody else in the GNU one of those portfolios. And then there wouldn't be that conflation politically. But just to clarify, I'm a Democrat. I actually was one of the subcommittee chairs in the Biden campaign. So I'm speaking at it from a objective third party view on
I
this.
appreciate that. Just very last question, Michael. Even though Trump threatens he'll skip the G20, let's hope he does come, because I think there needs to be continuity into the US that takes over the presidency in 2026. Do you think a bilateral is necessary, is needed before we see November, bilateral between South Africa and the United States?
Well, we just had a delegation come to Washington, and the delegation from South Africa came to Washington to try to find common ground, to find a way for a path forward. The way it got framed in South Africa, obviously, was it was explaining to the Trump administration what they got wrong about the expropriation bill and about the education bill and about these things. And that didn't go over very well in Washington. And, I think that one of the issues with the bilateral only works if the two sides can find common ground, can find space for a conversation. And the South African delegation wanted to do trust building. They wanted to find ways to move forward. But the Trump administration is really saying we want to see action. We want to see change. We want to see, especially in the case of Iran, they want to see a change with the South African-Iran relationship, and they want to see a change with respect to the various bills that they have a concern with as expressing state-sponsored racism. So until that happens, a bilateral itself isn't going to really change the course of the relationship. It's going to take really, I think as I said, the Trump administration is not going to blink.
Yeah.
I think they're very committed on this.
Okay. Michael Walsh, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us.